Welcome to the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast, the show for people who are ready to break out of survival mode in order to build a truly thriving life. I'm Amanda Solman, and along with Mark Jewell, my co-host and the founder and CEO of Mark Jewell Speaking and Training, we break down common roadblocks that keep people stuck surviving and share ideas to help you thrive each and every day.
This week on the pod, Mark and I are talking about something that can sometimes be a bit of a tough topic, and that is shame. If there is one area that we find most often keeps people from breaking out of survival mode, shame is it. So we're going to break it down. We're going to talk about what it is and what's worked for us in terms of moving forward and moving through it in a little more effective manner. I do want to just put in a quick heads up that we will discuss the topic of suicide and mental health in this conversation. So with that, if you or someone you know is in need of it, please do not hesitate to reach out to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255, available 24 hours a day, and they also have an online chat. We all need to take care of each other, so please do not hesitate to use that resource if you find that it is needed. So with that, let's jump into the episode and let's talk about shame.
So this week in our conversation, we are going to be talking about a topic that I think it's actually kind of interesting, has come up in a lot of different places recently. Mark, you and I were doing a podcast a few weeks ago where in brief passing, we mentioned the topic of shame and how we were going to dive further into it, which was funny because one of our clients that I was talking to yesterday actually picked up on that brief little mention and referenced it. And I was like, oh man, we didn't even get that far into it. And you already picked up on that topic. So like it's standing out for the people we work with. And then I know I just finished reading the book Daring Greatly by Brene Brown, which is all about like shame and vulnerability from top to bottom. And just heads up, I know I'm going to be referencing that a lot. So just want to put that caveat out there before we get started. But Mark, I want you to kind of kick us off here with, when you think about shame, what are some of your initial thoughts around this topic?
Absolutely. So this was a topic that I really wanted us to dive into because it's the first thing that comes up for me is that this is probably no, it's not even probably, this is the number one thing that I think is keeping a lot of our coaching clients stuck. I know that for me personally in the past, this was the number one thing that kept me stuck from, trying new things or stepping out, sticking your neck out, so to speak. And so it's very personal to me personally from that perspective. I see a lot of my clients, knowing that there's maybe a better way to do something, but then not doing that because that would be different than how maybe their predecessor did it, or how their boss did it, or how their spouse does it, or how their mom and dad did it, right? And so rather than try something new and innovate, we just we just keep spinning the same wheel, or we try to recreate the same wheel rather than doing something different. So this one is deeply personal to me because I have a very deeply personal experience with shame itself. And I've done a lot of work specifically in the last 2 years personally and it hasn't even been in the spirit of overcoming shame. It's been in being able to experience more of what I want, which meant I had to find a way to either minimize shame or find a way to quickly get over it or move past it so that I could, be able to experience more of what it was that I wanted in life. And so that's why I really wanted to dive into this, hopefully provide a useful resource for, whatever it's you're just passing by and you happen to pick up on this episode, or you're one of our coaching clients and, you've been doing the work and diving deep and, wherever you are in that journey. I'm hoping that this really serves some people to be able to live their best life by being able to move past, move through, get around, go underneath, whatever you got to do so that shame does not have to control you.
When looking at Brene Brown's work, as she describes shame, right, she talks about like it's this feeling that because there's something wrong with us, we are not worthy of love and belonging. So, right, we talk about shame as I'm not doing things like someone else does them or like someone else expects that I should. But what's interesting to me is like so much of that at its core is about a fear of being disconnected or not being worthy of that love, of that belonging with others, which relates back to other topics that we've talked about in the past with the 6 basic human needs and
Mhm.
connection being one of those really core human needs that we all have to experience. So I think that's something to keep in mind is that when you are experiencing shame, it is most likely a trigger around connection and feeling like you're going to lose that connection or that you're not worthy of that connection. So it's always
Mhm.
interesting to me how some of these concepts all weave together and tie together, and it's like when we talk about one, we often can bring in another. So the other
Yeah.
thing that I just wanted to hit on, and I'm kind of curious of maybe how you experience it or how you've seen other people experience it. One thing that's been really helpful for me in trying to understand the concept of shame is how shame is different from other more negative emotions. So,
Mhm.
for example, like shame is this idea that I am bad, like it's about you, it's about something core to you. Whereas, like a feeling like guilt is about an action. Guilt is all about like I did something bad. So that's been really
Right.
helpful for me contextually as to how,
Mhm.
okay, when am I feeling shame versus when am I feeling guilt or embarrassment or some other kind of negative emotion. And so I'm curious, how has that sort of shown up for you, or how do you interpret that for
Mhm.
yourself?
So here's when I think about the difference between shame and guilt per se, like as you just describe it here, I think that's really spot on. So it's when you're feeling guilty, right? That's like when you feel like you've let somebody down in a way, and they're very very close. I mean, internally, like you probably feel almost identically. Yeah, there's just when we think about different human emotions, right? And then just getting even beyond guilt as an example. So there's shame, there's guilt, sadness, anger, rage, right? All kinds of different, maybe like we're trending on the negative side. We'll move to the more positive side in a minute. But what when my understanding of human emotion really shifted was a few years ago when I started diving back into a book that my dad actually gave me, which is called Power versus Force. And Power versus Force is the name of the author is evading me, and we'll have to look it up and pop it into the show notes. But what they have done, what the author of this book has done, is researched, human emotion, and it talks about how using your personal power as opposed to being forceful to get what you want is the better way. And so they actually have created a way to be able to calibrate all human emotion. So basically, from a scale from 0 to 1,000, they can take human emotion and they can calibrate it based on it's what they call its vibrational frequency. And so what's interesting to me, and this is where this really started to take where the seed was planted maybe 10 years ago when I first read it, and then a couple 3 years ago when I started diving back into the material, is it really was profoundly impactful to me when I figured out that the lowest vibrating, the lowest frequency of all human emotion, when I would have thought it's rage or anger or even guilt, because that's like you feel like you've done something to somebody. But no, the lowest strength, the lowest vibrating human emotion is actually shame, below anger, below sadness, below grief, like all the things which you think are like that's the thing you want to avoid the most. But the reality is, it is the lowest. And so what we actually do as humans is we try to avoid shame, like we're trying to avoid that negative frequency in our life, and we want more of what we want, which on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, to go to the positive side, on the top end of the vibrational frequency and the calibration scale, if you will, for all human emotion, is joy. That's the highest. And then just below that is love, right? So things like joy and love are on the complete opposite end. And so when you think about it this way, so I want to tie this back to your statement around the 6 basic human needs. Okay. So often when we've done something in the past that makes us feel like we're going to lose a connection with somebody, or for whatever reason we just don't feel like we're going to fit in with that group, like that's when we sort of assume this attitude of shame. We sort of like, and this is what we do. So there's the connection piece. And one of the other six basic needs is actually significance. And so there's two ways. So when it's us shaming ourselves for because we're not good enough, because whatever story we have going on in our head, what we think, what we do is we mentally sever that connection, or we damage that connection between us and others. Where we do it to other people is we manipulate them by making them feel insignificant. And so when somebody screws up, when somebody does something around you, like we even do this to our dogs, we do this to our kids, what do we say? Shame on you for having that opinion, for doing that thing, for this literally happened at an event that you and I were at the other day, where somebody literally walked in the room that had a difference of opinion than I have on a particular topic and said, shame on you for having that, right? So that's where they're trying to belittle your significance. And so here's what's interesting about humans and how we go about doing things is we actually, in the pursuit of trying to feel better or be better or make people be more like us, rather than praise them, right? Rather than give them positive recognition, rather than sit down and have proactive discussion with them and use higher, calibrated human emotions, what we do is we often default, because of our programming, we default to using shame, and we say, you shouldn't be that way. Right. And your parents all of your life have been saying things like, you shouldn't, or don't do that because that's shameful or whatever. And there's I think you've got a whole list of things where we experience shame. So I want to dive into that at some point. But what I really wanted to set up with this little soapbox rant here was this whole idea that the reason that we are experiencing shame is, number one, because your programming suggested this has been modeled, but really where it comes from is a place of trying to stay safe and trying to fit in. And so that's where that connection piece is really, really important. And so we will stay in an unhappy state, we will stay in an unhappy in a job, we will stay unhappy in a relationship, to avoid the shame of what other people think, or what we think other people will think, even though we probably have no idea. But we will stay in a negative circumstance in order to avoid the shame of others, right? Not to find a way to experience more joy here, not to like say, oh, this, I'm going to find a way to make this joyful. No, we do it to avoid the danger, the perceived danger of shame from other people, or even shame, internally. We like, if as long as I stay, I can still feel good about myself, which is really just more trying to avoid what other people are going on or have going on, and we think they have going on in their minds. But this is a really really important one, because what I see in the corporate space, which is where we spend a lot of our time working, is people who are avoiding making sales calls, taking risks, submitting new ideas, innovating, trying something new, learning a new skill set. In fact, people love to go learn new skill sets, and then they shelve the damn skill set because they're afraid of what it's going to look like when somebody sees them do it. It may not work perfectly the first time. And so this is what happens: is we continue to, we leverage shame initially to train people. We leverage shame to teach people how to be like us. And then when it's our turn to go and try something new, we actually shame ourselves into staying stuck. All in the name of connection. All in the name of fitting in, right? All in the name of, hopefully finding ways to experience significance, which, in my personal opinion, is not the point of life at all.
So I have lots of thoughts as you share all of that. It's interesting that often we use shame to garner significance, or we try to avoid dealing with our shame as a way to stay connected to people. Um, but usually, like, especially the significance one, if we are using shame as a way to make ourselves feel important, it's usually because there's something within us that we're also ashamed of,
Mhm.
right? Like, it's, again, it's that mirror reflection of I'm projecting out onto others what I'm actually feeling inside myself, which I always find that fascinating. One other thing, as you were actually two thoughts. One, when you were talking about the frequency of shame, right, and that it is basically the lowest frequency emotion that you can experience,
Mhm.
I think it's interesting how that shows up in other research. Um it and again, I keep saying, I will keep referring to Brene Brown and Daring Greatly. I am not taking credit for any of this, but um, she cites some research where they have looked at, there is literally no positive outcome associated with shame,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
So you can think of guilt. There, the positives of guilt is that you recognize that doing certain behaviors is not good, and so you avoid doing those behaviors in the future. Or anger, maybe, there are some positives with working through anger or working through sadness. But all of the research shows that, like, there are zero positive attributes to experiencing shame. And they say, shame is actually much more likely to be the cause of destructive and hurtful behavior than it is to be the solution. So, going back to your example of using shame in parenting or using shame in management, like, there's literally no positive outcome that's going to
Mhm.
come with that.
Yeah.
Um, and so I just think that's really important to remember, is like, it's super low from an energy standpoint for you to experience. And if you actually want positive outcomes, using it on others, it's not going to get you where you want to be.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
the other
Absolutely.
the other thing you said is, like, most of us are trying to avoid this because we're afraid if we deal with our shame, then we'll experience that disconnection. And I was mentioning this quote to you before we jumped on and started recording. But one of my favorite parallels that Brene Brown talks about is that we all try to avoid this, but the reality is every single one of us experiences shame in some way, shape, or form.
Mhm.
So, what you said earlier, right? Either try to minimize it or work through it as quickly as possible, because avoiding it is not the answer, because we all have it. And so, what she says is, you either deal with your shame, or the only people who don't experience shame are psychopaths or sociopaths.
Yeah.
So, like, you get a choice, right? You either
Yeah.
deal with your shame or you're a sociopath. And one
Right.
choice is usually better than the other.
Exactly.
So I always think that's like a nice way to lighten it up. It's like, you know what? When sociopath is my other option, shame doesn't seem so bad. I should just deal with it.
Right, right. Well, so let's do this. Let's create, like, I mean, maybe some ground rules for the game, of experience more of what you want, so that at least you understand, like, there is a purpose to shame. Like, I understand Brene Brown's point of, like, there's no positive outcome. That's true. We could say the same for something like cortisol as an example, right? Right. It's a stress hormone, that your body produces. Well, what's it for? Well, it's there. Like, your idea is to, or what's supposed to happen is you pick up on the fact that you're experiencing stress, and then you do something about it. Right? It's there to tell you, stop doing the thing that's making you stressed. So it has a purpose. But here's what we buy into, right? Is the idea based on what goes on in life is, like, we've made it normal to be stressed out all the time. Right? It's like, oh, they're stressed out and I'm stressed out and everybody else is stressed out. So it must be you're supposed to be stressed out. And so we just have this, like, massive overdose in society of cortisol all the time. We do the same with shame, right? So shame has a purpose. Shame is there, like, it doesn't feel good. Okay. Like, it doesn't feel good to have shame in your body and to be experiencing it. Yet we submit ourselves to an overdose of it all the time, right? It's just like, because of our programming that came from your upbringing and all the things. Um, but and we, like, by default, like, I even catch myself working with my kids, and I want to share a couple stories. Please remind me to do so, like, where I experienced the programming of shame as a kid, that I recently did some work to overcome. So I want to share that, how we did that in that resource. But by and large, we just buy into this default programming that, well, it's normal to be in shame, to experience shame, to feel shame, and so that must be the way it's supposed to be. And we never pause to ask the question, well, what if it didn't have to be that way? Right? Like, what if my norm, what if my default was to experience more joy, more love, more happiness, more peace, more whatever you want that's on the more positive end of the emotional spectrum? Like, what if I was supposed to be like that every day? Like, right? Like, what if instead of avoiding shame, like I was constantly looking for ways to embrace joy more, right? By the way, just make sure that when I say joy, I want you to make sure that you understand there's a difference between pleasure and joy. Okay? Since both are good, right? But joy you can have as much of, and like there's almost never a negative. It's the complete opposite of shame, right? So if there's never anything good that comes from shame, there's never anything bad that comes from experiencing joy. Pleasure, on the other hand, right? Pleasure is one Coors Light. Okay, pleasure in overdrive is six of them, right? Or eight of them, like in a row, or in an hour. So like you get the idea. So
Yep.
that's a as we think about creating some ground rules for like how do you be able to play within the game, it's starting to create like what is your standard. Like if you start to experience internal shame, so you're shaming yourself, or external shame, somebody else is doing that to you, how do you potentially get to train yourself or train that other person how you desire to be treated, right? What is your level of tolerance? Like once you realize that you're in the emotion of shame, like how long, if you set a timer, how long are you willing to let yourself stay there, right? And that's a game that only you can define for yourself. Like you get to choose what that is. For me, it's not long. Like I just choose to not live there as much as possible. Do I feel it? Do I experience it? Absolutely, right? Good news is I'm not a sociopath, right? Um, so, but I just choose not to want very much of that in my life. Like I notice, like if I feel it, okay, great. Where is that coming from? Maybe I can meditate on that. Maybe I can go to work on that. Maybe there's something for me to learn. Maybe it helped me understand and be more compassionate to somebody else. Because when that happened to me, then I learned now I'm not going to do that to somebody else because I realized how that makes people feel, right? So there's actually a positive outcome, but that's a learning, and I transmute it into some other energy. So the game gets played when you understand, like, what are you willing to allow for yourself, and in your avatar in the game, how much joy and love do they experience versus how much shame do they experience? And you get to determine what the right levels are for you and your avatar, and you can paint it whatever color you want and all the things, but just define a winnable game for yourself, right? And if you're continuously getting stuck in an attitude of shame and you just feel like you're not good enough for everybody else, and everybody else thinks you're negative or bad, and your outlook on yourself is that way, then that's where it's time to go get some help, right? Whether it's a coaching program or like actual help. I mean, if you're constantly stuck in shame and can't find a way out, like let me pause and say this, get some counseling. Find a way into it. Look at your insurance program, at your company, look at whatever you've got, any resources in your community, and like get in somewhere and talk to somebody for real, because it does not have to be your norm to live in a space of shame. And then just as a little bit of a side note, because I know this comes up a lot within our ag industry, the high suicide rate in the farming community, high suicide rate in military, obviously, and all the different areas around there, where we often experience a lot of shame is when we feel like we're losing our identity, right? In the entrepreneurial community, which is where I spend a lot of time, also a very high suicide rate amongst entrepreneurs. Why? Because when things get tough and I don't have money, or I can't pay my bills, or I seem to not be able to make it work, or I can't keep everybody happy, or I can't support those around me, or whatever the difficulty has become, usually around money, not always, but often around money, or when I've let somebody down, right? And I've feel like I've let them down. So now I'm experiencing internal shame. But when my identity is threatened and I'm going to lose my farm, or I feel like I'm going to lose my business or my way of life or whatever that looks like, the trap that we fall into is that I can't ever see myself doing something differently. And that is my identity. That is who I am. And when we face the chapter of our life where we might have to start to redefine who we are, what we often experience is shame, because in the back of our minds, that's who everybody else sees us as. And we feel like we're letting them down. If you had to put off paying a bill, or renegotiate terms, or potentially look at filing bankruptcy, the level of depression becomes so high because you are worried about what the other person will think. You're worried about what the other person will feel. Your reputation is on the line, and all of those things. And the message I want to say, because I've been there, and I've been on the verge of losing my business, and I've bankrupted a business, and I've done these things. And so like, I get that. And no matter how bad the story gets, okay, just recognize, like, that's just the dark hour of the storm. Like, I get it. Like, I've had to go months in this business. I've had to go months in the previous business that didn't make it, where it's just like, I don't know how I'm going to make this go. I don't know how I'm going to pay this off. I spent 4 years paying off a $10,000 loan from somebody in my first business that failed, because that's just what it took to get through it. And it was disappointing. And I felt like I let them down, and my confidence was shit, and all the things. And I just felt like a failure. And because I was just willing to continue to persist through that, even though my identity took a ding, um, here we are working our way back out of that, and into something even better. So, just trust that our triggers are our teachers. Your triggers are not there to knock you down. They're not there to make you experience shame. Your triggers are there to help teach you and guide you down the path towards something even greater. I just felt really compelled to share that right now, because that theme keeps coming up, and people keep sending me the Facebook message about the high suicide rate amongst farmers, and the high suicide rates with entrepreneurs, and the high suicide rates of military personnel, and all the things. And so when it's the darkest hour, like, just keep clinging on. Like, if it hurts, it's going to hurt a little bit more, but just as long as it still hurts, you're still in the game.
Yep. I appreciate you addressing that. And I think your comment about triggers actually is a really good one to dig a little bit more into, right? So we talked about, we're going to get into what are some ways that you can deal with shame, what are some ways you can set some of those new standards for yourself. But I do want to make sure I touch base on one thing you mentioned earlier when you said, I've got a whole list of things that tend to be shame triggers for people. And so just like when we teach the story concept, one of the first steps to changing the story, one of the first steps to dealing with the shame that you're dealing with, is you've got to know what triggers those feelings for you.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we often talk about triggers as this is your fight or flight, right? This is where you either run, hide, or come out swinging, as Terry Greatly would talk about. And they talk about both
Yeah.
physical signs, right? So you mentioned cortisol earlier, right? It's, the
Mm-hmm.
tense shoulders, the headaches, the stomach discomfort, right? Like, there are physical things that come with the stress of shame over time. There's also the emotional things, there's, maybe not surface level is not the right term, but shutting down, getting angry, or even more serious things like depression or anxiety that come with shame. But you mentioned earlier, so some of the top shame triggers that have come out from those who research shame: appearance and body image, money and work, motherhood/fatherhood, family, parenting, mental and physical health, addiction, sex, aging, religion, surviving trauma, and being stereotyped or labeled. Like, these are the things that study after study after study are common shame triggers for folks. Some of them related to upbringing. A lot of them are societal. Like, especially when we talk about things like appearance and body image, or money, work, parenthood. Like, I think about how many, I'm sort of in an age group where a lot of my friends are starting to have kids, and the number of times, they talk about it as mom guilt, right? They use the word guilt, but the reality is, at the core of that is shame, that I am a terrible parent. I am a terrible mama, like, and so
Yeah. It's mom shaming.
mom shaming, exactly. And
It's a real
so
thing.
So again, we talk about like everybody experiences shame. I think probably most of us can find at least one or two or more things on this list where we've been triggered, had a shame trigger around it. So,
Yeah.
again, I just want to
That's
kind of lay that out on the table from an example standpoint.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's one of my favorite ones, right? So like, I don't know. I know we have actually a high degree of young women that listen to this podcast. So if you're in the process of becoming mom, or you are a mom, or, you got a couple little kids or whatever, like, let's just look around at what goes on in that community. I know, like, when we first had kids, that was kind of that time frame. This is going back a decade. Okay. A little bit on the older end of the spectrum now on the, the kid production cycle, but the cloth diapers were coming back into like fashion at this point. Okay. We took 30 years off, and we're going back to cloth because it's
Nothing
good for the
about that
environment.
seems fashionable.
No, it's fucking horrible. But but we went into this whole, like, my wife wanted to do it, because it's good for the environment and it's good for the baby, and there's all no chemicals and all the whatever. So whatever, we dropped and it was more cost effective, right? So you drop $500 up front, but then you don't buy diapers for 2 years, right? And everybody else spends a couple grand. So you could justify this 6 ways until Tuesday. And it is great. And if it's for you, I'm not making fun of you at all. Okay. I sprayed more freaking diapers in the first 3 years of having kids than I would like you to know. And so, like, I get it. I've lived it. I've done it. I'm fully credible to say what I'm about to say is, like, if you are the mom that doesn't want to have cloth diapers just because, like, you don't give a shit, then get the freaking Huggies from the store or whatever. Like, I don't know, is Huggies sponsoring this? Maybe, but no, we don't have that much yet. So, but, like, whatever feels good for you and like you want to do, then great. When we had our third kid, like on the first one, the second one, we're all in and like doing the thing, doing it the right way, like giving the kid the best chance to succeed and all that stuff. Whenever it came along, I'm like, babe, if you want to do it, that's great, but you're washing the damn things. I just put my foot down. I'm like, I'm not doing it this time. Like, you get to wash them, right? And I'm like, I'm not all in on the cloth diapers this time. And I'm like, if you leave, I will go to Walgreens. I will buy some freaking regular diapers, and that's what I'm using until you get home. Like, that is literally what's going to go down. And so the cloth diapers did not make it into this child's life, at least not in any level of depth. And here's where it came from. I'm in such a different place on kid 3 than I was on kid 1, because on kid 1, you're concerned, like, you don't know what the hell you're doing, and it's a freaking war inside your mind over, like, you think especially if you're the mom, like, you think you're screwing it up all the way along. I mean, there's just all this negative self-talk and all the things. So again, create a boundary for yourself. Like, how much negative self-talk are you willing to endure? And if it's becoming too much, then we need to find a way to disrupt the pattern and start to shift the story so that you can start to live into something else. But if all the moms are wearing, if they're wearing their babies, right, and you don't want to wear your baby, you just want to put them in the damn stroller because that's more comfortable for you and you don't want to wreck your back, cool, good for you. Vice versa, flip side, whatever, just do what feels good for you, right? Like, that's what I'm trying to get at. And I'm shaming the shamers, right? I mean, it's just like, that's how deep the freaking programming is, Amanda, right?
Can you tell that Mark is triggered by
But that was that was the number one thing I know that created stress in the relationship for us at home at that point. Was not even like that we had a difference of opinion. It's that the reason that we're doing a lot of the things, is because, well, that's what all the other moms are doing, or that's what the mommy bloggers are doing, and they must know more than I do because they've been doing this for a while, and I want to fit in with them, and I want to be recognized with them, and I want to get invited to go down to the park and do play dates with them, and all the things, right? And so, in order to fit in, we try to avoid shame, and so you do shit you don't want to do just to do that,
and
and
still
it's just
feel
because
shame at the end of the day because you're still not
exactly.
quite sure you're measuring up. Yeah. Yeah.
Because you're not true to
Right.
you. You're being true to other people to try to fit in, when at the end of the day, like, you don't want to wash the freaking diaper when you get home. Like, you just want to put the kid in some whatever Pampers and put them to bed because that's easier, and you want to go have a glass of wine. That's actually you on the inside. And so the only way to more fully avoid shame, or to not experience it, is to just know what makes you happy.
Mhm.
to get in touch and make a list of the stuff that makes you happy. And if you can follow that path, as opposed to avoiding shame because other people are doing it differently or whatever, then that's when it's like suddenly the shame triggers start to show up less and less when you start living into what makes you happy. And this is when you mentioned the thing before we started the podcast, Amanda, about like being a sociopath if you don't experience shame. I experience very, very little shame anymore. Like it does come up. I did. So I know I'm not there yet. Like I do get triggered. But compared to me 10 years ago, right. And even 3 or 4 years ago, like it's becoming less and less and less. And so I was like thinking, as we've been talking through this last 36 minutes, like, what is it? Like, why is it that I'm not experiencing as much? And it's specifically this: I am learning more and more what makes me happy and what do I want? What do I want to be experiencing? And then I'm making that my standard. I'm making that my priority. And that's it. And I'm like, fuck what everybody else thinks. Like, like to heck with what everybody else thinks. Like, one of my big things that I struggled with early on in speaking is, not wearing a suit on stage. I grew up on a leech farm, guys. I'm not like, my normal is not suit and tie. Like, that's not how I'm hardwired. And what I wanted, I grew up in a jeans and t-shirt. So here's what I do. I throw a sports coat on over my t-shirt now. And I wear that on stage. I put a pair of dress shoes on to be respectful. And I've got my Thrive Today shirt. And I am so comfortable on stage now. I don't worry about whether you like what I wear or not. I'm not concerned at all about if you're thinking about how I look. I'm not, because I'm totally cool with me. And guess what? Nobody ever says anything anymore. Like, they may be thinking it, but they're not bringing it up because I'm super comfortable doing it my way. So when you start to own into those things, that you want to have more of and live into that, the shame triggers will start to show up less and less and less. And, you went through all the shame triggers, right? Appearance and body image, right? So maybe you're totally comfortable with whatever your appearance and body image is. Like, if you can convince yourself that that's okay, then we can, my hope is that we can start to give fewer and fewer shits about what other people think. Aging. So that's one that's coming up for me, right? Like, my skin started changing colors last year. My pigment all died, and I've got splotches on my face, and I've got leopard prints on my hands from the tan, and I've got a soul patch on my chest where the sun doesn't tan like right over my solar plexus anymore. I call it my soul patch, because like I just decided, like, I don't know how to change it. Like, there is no cure for this little skin autoimmune disorder, and so I'm just going to own it. I mean, like, when I owned into that, and the one thing I'll say is I get that it's maybe a little bit easier for me to do that because I've got 3.5 years of momentum of practicing that mentality. Okay. And so here's the thing that I'm just going to suggest. So I get that it's easier, not easy, for me, but the concept is simple. Okay. Can you just get in touch with what you want to be experiencing in all these areas? Okay. Religion, aging, sex, addiction, your mental health, physical health, parenting, whatever, all the things. Family's the big one, right? Like, how do you get over all the stuff with the family? Okay. All that aside, there's more depth than we have any time to go into here today. But can you set your standards for how you want to experience life, and then commit to living into that? Commit some time each day to doing things that take you closer to that and further away from feeling shame around those areas. And here's what I can promise you is there's no silver bullet for this one. This is not, if you do this, this, and this, and just follow the Survivor's Guide to Thriving in 6 days, you're going to not have shame. It's not going to work that way. That's not it. Okay. But it's little by little by little, the whole Kaizen principle, small, seemingly insignificant, never ending improvement, daily stuff of living into what you want to own in this life, and stop caring less and less and less what other people think about that. Most people, I find a lot of old people stop giving a lot of cares about like what other people think when they get to the end. I mean, I've seen my mom, 74 years old. She could give two shits less what you think about her anymore. But I remember distinctly when I was a kid, that was not the case. Distinctly when she was 37, when she was my age, she was 37 when I was born. So it's probably about 3 or 4 years after that. I can distinctly remember like having to be a certain way, having to do things a certain way in order to make sure that we fit in with the town folk.
I think that is a really interesting observation that I guess I haven't really thought much about. But now that you say it, like there is definitely something to that. I would say, my dad's kind of getting close to retirement, and it's like the same thing. It's like, psh, whatever. I don't care what people think of it. Like, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm at this phase, and so I think there's something interesting to that that would be
Mhm.
kind of neat to look at, as like the difference of the experience of shame in younger people versus older people. I do know, and I don't necessarily want to go into this too deep, but I thought it was interesting that they have looked at the difference of experience of shame between like men and women, and
Mm.
like that it feels the same, right? You still get like the tense body, you still, the headache, the, depression or anger or sadness or whatever that comes with it. But they were
Mhm.
saying that like in that list of triggers, some of them tend to be more frequent with women versus men, or that there's like perceived differently. So like with women, they were saying shame really comes around like this idea that you have to do it all, right? You got to look good, you got to be smart, you got to have a clean house, be a great mom, and don't ever let anybody see the work that goes into that. Like, right? Like the shame is just like, I
Mhm.
have to
Mhm.
be everything. Whereas they were saying like with men, it comes down to one thought and one thought only, and that is, do not ever be perceived as weak. And if there is
Mhm.
anything that you're
Yeah.
feeling that makes you feel weak, it's automatically a shame trigger. So if like your body makes you feel
Mm.
weak, you're ashamed of that. Or if you feel like you're not a great husband or a great provider for your family, that's weakness and that's a shame trigger. So I thought that was really kind of an
Yeah.
interesting thing, is like we're all sort of triggered by these things, but men and women tend to experience them just slightly differently.
Yeah. I think that makes total sense. I mean, I 100% agree. I think at least from a dude's perspective, I mean, anytime that you're, it's like, what will they think of me? How will they perceive me? What are some of the classic things? Like, you don't take handouts,
Mhm.
right? Don't get help. Don't ask for directions, right? All the things that go in
Don't
with
be
that.
sad.
Like, why do the nutrition industry, as an example, like, I mean, they're constantly promoting supplementation and things like that to men around physique, body, longevity. Now the new thing is, there's a company in Omaha called the Limitless Male, right? And so all their advertising is like, is your testosterone low? How the hell would I know what's wrong with my testosterone? Well, this could happen and this could happen and all the things, right? So you better get your testosterone checked and come get a $500 shot. So,
Mhm.
right. So you start playing to that weakness of vulnerability. So at least from the dude's perspective, and I'm certainly not competent to speak about it from the female perspective.
Yep.
I would say that to be true. I do know, and just generally we know from being in our world, men are focused on one or two things at a time. Women, it's all the things all the time, going on inside the mind, right? So there's more chaos on that side than guys have it pretty easy. I know that for sure.
Well, I mean, from the female side of it, like, I think it's evident in how we, actually how we compliment other women, right? Because we'll often say, like, I just don't know how she does it all, right? We're so impressed by like all the things that, the philosophical she is able to do.
Yeah.
When reality probably is behind the scenes, she's fallen apart just as much as you are. But it's the image of being able to have the career and the
Mhm.
kids and the great spouse and like and look gorgeous doing it, right? It's like it. And so yeah, I think I'm spot on from the female side. I would agree that those things are pretty realistic as well. So
Yeah.
that aside, I want to go back to something else you were talking about, which was like, the how do you deal with these shame triggers? How do you make them less frequent? How do you move through them more quickly, or make them less severe? And what was interesting is that as you were talking through it, and you saw me on the other side. So for those who are listening to the podcast, we're also on video, so Mark can see me and I can see him. And as he was saying, well, I know it's easier for me because I've been doing this, and I'm just smiling over here because I always joke that that's kind of true to some extent. But what you were talking about, I think, sort of layers in to some of kind of the steps that other people have sort of recommended for, based on, like, shame research and what seems to be effective. And so I kind of want to back up and walk through these, because I think
Mhm.
all of these showed up in what you were saying. But if we back up to somebody who maybe hasn't done all of the work that you have been doing, maybe this is kind of a
Right.
different way to look at the same thing you were saying. So
Or more
so
of a
what's
logical
that?
how-to. A
Yeah.
little bit more of a logical how-to.
I'm a very linear thinker, so I like processes and like a very seamless approach. But so they talk about three big things that I think are good points of reflection if you find yourself struggling with some of these triggers. So the first thing they highlight is this idea of practicing critical awareness. And the two questions is, are the
Mhm.
expectations that are driving my shame, are they realistic or attainable? Right. So again, I'll jump back to what we were just talking about with, like, the expectation of women to have it all, to do it all, to look it all, to all of these things. Like, when you really get critical at that expectation, like, this is not realistic or attainable, right? You start to hear people say, like, you can do anything, but you can't do everything, right? And the expectation is that you do everything. And so when you really dig into that and ask yourself, is this expectation, like, is this even realistic or attainable? 9 times out of 10, it's not. And then the other thing that I think is a good question to ask yourself on this is, are those expectations your expectations or someone else's? I also think, I don't know your thoughts, but
Mm.
I also think 9 times out of 10, the expectations are not even, well, they're yours, but they're yours because they're someone else's. And you're trying to create that connection for yourself.
Yeah, so I think the we build up this story about what we think the expectations of other people are going to be. I think that's where a lot of, where I think there's a lot of avoidable shame in the arena where that happens, where you have a story about what you think they want, right? Or what you think they're doing, or what you think, whatever. And it's really, really far off. It's really, really far off from the truth. So I agree. I mean, generally speaking, anytime that your experience is not matching up with your expectations, regardless of where those expectations come from, like, that's when we go into this place of guilt and shame. And we can reframe that into just saying, like, you don't have to feel that, but we do. We're programmed to, and that's why it seems so hard to get past it.
The second thing that they talk about is the idea of reaching out. And so I think this is a really important piece of it that maybe we could dig in. I don't want to send this podcast off the rails for too long here, but um, you know, a critical part of overcoming shame is, number one, when we talk about this a lot, is owning your story. Like,
Yeah.
where is the shame coming from? I need to understand my hardwiring. I need to understand my 95%. What are the experiences that led me to being triggered by this thing, right? And it could be any number of things based on your life experience. But before you can tackle your shame, I think you really have to get real with where that shame is coming from. Because otherwise, we're just like trying to grab at things that we hope will fix it without actually knowing what the root cause of where that shame is
Mhm.
coming from
And I'll even
is.
say this, just to back that up, like, those clients that come into our programs that make massive progress versus those that don't are ones that just fully own the fact that, like, yeah, like, I'm not perfect here, or I'm not doing great here. Or just had a conversation with one of our clients on the way up here last night who's just like, who's frustrated. And the conversation was about the boss and the frustration and all that. And then, oh, by the way, like, I'm not making my numbers. Right. So now now we have the whole picture, and we can own that. Right now we can go somewhere. Right. If we're not owning the whole story and, like, what's really true, then it just becomes another story, and we end up creating something that's not real, coming out of that. So, and just, getting vulnerable, like, this is me. I am not perfect. I have flaws. right? Whatever, I could pick apart my own all day long. I don't plan well. I don't think about like, I have strategic mindedness and I get lost in the clouds and, all the things like whatever, like those are all things that are my imperfections, right? I get overly enthusiastic and I forget what the hell anybody else thought or thinks, because I know it's going to work. So like, yeah, those are all like my things that I know about myself that I've owned, right? That I fully owned. And that's why, like, if I've made even 1% improvement on any of those, it's because I owned it and just was like, yeah, like, even as I say that, like 2 years ago, even 2.5 years ago, to say something like that for me would have been like, oh God, like, what are they going to think?
I
You
think
know?
especially in the work we do, because it's sometimes I have to remind myself like we need to open up and share our vulnerability and where we feel our shame triggers just as much as we ask our clients to. Like I think
Mhm.
sometimes on this podcast, even like, oh, it may sound to those listening like we have all the answers, but like we're figuring it out too, and we're just sharing what works for us. But
Yeah.
sometimes I think in the personal development space there can be that like pressure to act like you've got it all together, right? Because you're trying to tell people
Right.
how to get their lives together, so you better have yours together too.
Yeah.
um and so
Yeah.
but you hit on something that is, I think, is really critical to this, and that is that vulnerability, that sharing your story. So it's one thing to like own your story, it's another thing to be willing to say that to someone else, right? Because I
Mhm.
think a lot of times we'll know like, yeah, I had a really shitty childhood, or yeah, I'm really struggling with my marriage. Like we'll know that in our own head, but until we're willing to open up and share that with others, it will continue to drive the shame train, like as long as it's just happening in you. And so one of the things that they talk about in Daring Greatly is that like shame hates to be shared, right? Like shame thrives in dark places. And so
Mhm.
one of the most powerful things that you can do to really work through your shame is to start talking about it. Like straight up say, right? Like I'm not hitting my numbers, and that like there's a piece of me that's ashamed that I'm not living up to my end of the bargain. Or my marriage is not going well, and there is a piece of me that's ashamed that I'm not pulling my weight in this thing, right? Or that
Yeah.
I'm not good enough or whatnot.
Mhm.
So I think that can be really powerful, and that's, to me, that's the part that we avoid more than anything.
Mhm.
Is like experiencing shame. It's funny, somebody in the book they talk about like people will say, oh, I'm bad at vulnerability, I don't do vulnerability. And one thing Brene Brown always says is like, I can guarantee you that if you don't do vulnerability, you're awesome at shame, because like those two
Wow.
things are two
Yeah.
peas in a pod.
Yeah. Yep.
If you tell me I don't do vulnerability, I can pretty much 100% tell you you do shame really super well.
Right. Wow. I have to share this really quick. I mentioned earlier in the podcast that I had at least one, maybe two stories that I wanted to share on this topic. And so what you just said really brings this up for me. I was struggling with something, and I don't remember what the thing was that I was struggling with, but I was working with one of my coaches, and this is a year ago that we were having this conversation, and she really pushed me to like, kind of dive deep on this. And and so one of the things, like, I've never personally had a problem fitting in. Like that's always been something that's been, I sort of hacked into that system and figured out how to fit in. But there's a vast majority of my 37 years where where I never felt like I belonged with a group for a day, with a team for, even, in family to some respect. And so my coach started taking me back through this little exercise and like diving into my childhood. So we understand the 95% of your hardwiring is done by the time you're 7 to 9 years old. And so like a lot of the things that happen to you in life before you are 7 years old tend to sort of just get projected and then recreated again and again and again in your life. And so we start diving into my psyche and into my childhood. And the question she kept asking me around whatever it was we were trying to dive into was, when did you first decide that was so? When did you first decide that was the case? And we ended up going into something that was a little bit different than what we started to work on. But I found myself remembering for the very first time in 30 years, I'm remembering a moment when I was in kindergarten and I had won this little cowboy hat at the county fair, and it had a little feather on it. And I was so proud of that hat that I wanted to wear it to school for show and tell. And so I do, and I wear it into kindergarten. This is probably in the first month of the year because it was fall, right? We just come out of county fair time. And I have this hat on my head sitting there in the kindergarten classroom. And Mrs. Twist, my teacher, she comes over and she's like, and she says, Mark, you actually, it's school, you can't wear your hat here. And I remember feeling a little bit embarrassed, right? But it was just one of those things like, oh, I didn't know. Right. I was just learning the rules and like, oh, I didn't know. And so I take my hat off, whatever. I'm sure I blushed a little bit, but I'm just kind of put my hat down. And then I go into later on in the morning, we're standing in line to go to the bathroom. Well, back in those days, like you had those dividers, that divided one kindergarten class to the other. And there was a girl, and to this day, I know, and I'm not going to name her name on a podcast that's public, but like whatever, still friends with her, still know her to this day. We went to high school together. She made fun of me for having that cowboy hat and for getting in trouble, and made fun of Marky Mark wanting to be a little cowboy, that kind of thing. And it's just like this nah, 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 nah kind of tone to her voice. And I remember deciding, like I literally decided in that moment, and this is the power that we have to program ourselves when we're little kids like that. I decided that because of what happened, even though like I'm just a little kid who wanted to wear a cowboy hat. I love wearing hats to this day, love wearing hats. I just wanted to wear my cowboy hat. But I decided that I would do whatever it took to fit in. Remember, I said I don't have any problem fitting in anywhere I go. I can make friends. Doesn't matter. I know how to do. I have the skill set for that. But I will never belong. That was the decision that I made. And I spent the next 30 years easily making friends everywhere I go. No problem. Get on stage, go to an event, love meeting new people. I grew up in the sticks, totally alone. Like I had no siblings living at home by the time I came around, and no neighbor kids to play with. So I literally had to make up shit to do. So I loved to finally get around people. I had no problem going out and meeting new people. But I never felt connection, deep levels of connection, and never felt like I belonged to a team, fully belonged. And so I would create scenarios in my life where I literally I was always like the sixth man on the basketball team. I was never one of the important players in the group. I fit in with the group. I was friends with the group, but I was always like on the fringe of the group, never fully owning. And so my coach says to me after I told her the same story, she said to me, and this is interesting, what if you never decided that? What if you never decided that you don't belong? What would happen? And what was so interesting is like right then and there, it's almost like we rewired all the neural pathways that were attached to belonging. And I'm just like, yeah, what if I never decided that? What if I never decided that I don't belong? And what was so interesting is that I no longer, and this has been a full year, I've had zero shame. Anytime I go into one of our classrooms, anytime I go into a meeting of business decision makers on a sales call, anytime I get together with a new group of people, I almost automatically have this feeling of like, I just belong in the space. I no longer have the thought of shame around that area. So I share that for a couple of reasons. Number one, like there is work that you can do that will help you get to the root of your shame. And that's just one. Like I have probably thousands, right? But that was just one little thing that I found that's really helped me feel more connected with everybody around me. And that helps me help people more. Is like when I have a deep level of connection with you, I can help you better as a coach or as a trainer than I can otherwise. When I go on stage in front of, the other day we were on stage in front of 300, 350 people. I never once worried about whether they would like me. And the thought never went through my head, but that used to be the constant desire, was to want to be liked, to want to be connected. So, as we, talk about this whole idea of vulnerability, I share that story somewhat vulnerably because that was like a really, intimate, like that was just the little boy who wanted to be connected, who wants to be loved, who wants to have that. And I know that like inside you, whoever you are listening, like you have that piece of you too, that just wants to be connected and loved and cared for and be made to feel secure and taken care of and all the things. And so, the more you're willing to share that stuff with people around you, whether it's a coach, a counselor, a pastor, a friend, a mom, or whatever, like the faster the healing gets to happen.
I think that is a wonderful note to end on.
I agree. So yes, with that, guys, if you're looking for more cool resources and things, whether it's related to sales or leadership, or maybe some more stuff around shame over time, because I feel like we could probably dive into some of these processes and maybe provide some of those resources to you guys. We'll do more of that. But over at markjewelltraining.com, we've got the blog, we've got all the podcast links. I believe as of right now, you're probably listening to this on iTunes. I saw from Snapchat this morning that soon will be on Spotify and Google Play and some other places. So you can get this on all of your different types of devices. So that will be out there. But we've got the podcast over on the website as well. You can just stream it right off the website on your mobile device or on your laptop while you're at work. So there's that. Other cool resources, and we've got some events coming up. This will probably be out just in time to sneak into the Thriving Leader here coming up at the end of July. We might have a space open for you in there if you're looking to get in. Otherwise, start looking at some of our fall events. We've got a sales program coming up, I believe, in September, another Thriving Leader coming up in November. And so please, by all means, check in with us or check in with Wade or whoever it is on the team to be able to get in on those here this fall. So markjewelltraining.com for all the other resources. Make sure that if you're not subscribed to this on iTunes, that you get that way so that you get the updates on your phone and these downloads straight in there. And we appreciate you tuning in and diving into this conversation today around all of the things related to shame. It's such an important piece, and we don't want you to have to live in shame any more than is necessary. So choose a standard, choose what you want to live into, and start taking the actions and do the things, get vulnerable so that you don't have to live in shame anymore, because that's just a lifetime of surviving, and it's your time to thrive today. So let's go get it.
Thanks again for tuning into this week's episode. If you like what you heard, make sure to jump over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. We appreciate the feedback, and it helps other people find the show. As always, if you're looking for more resources to go from surviving to thriving, check out our website at www.markjewelltraining.com. That's Jewel with 2 L's. And you can find us under Mark Jewell Speaking and Training on all the major social networks. Remember, survival is dead. It's your time to thrive today. See you next week.